All right. Thank you for joining us. A special thanks to Nadia Hashimi for joining us tonight. I feel like with all you have going on in your life, this is probably a big ask. So we really do appreciate you spending the time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And this is actually, you get me to sneak away from all the craziness in the house. So thank you.
I'll just read a very short synopsis so that they've read your book, but they might not realize all the ins and outs of all that you do, because being an author is just one of them. Nadia Hashimi is a pediatrician turned novelist who draws on her Afghan culture to craft internationally best-selling books for adults as well as young readers. Her novels span generations and continents, taking on themes like forced migration, conflict, poverty, misogyny, colonialism, and addiction. She continues to serve on boards of organizations committed to educating and nurturing Afghanistan's most vulnerable children and empowering the female leaders of tomorrow. She's a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council and the Afghan American Foundation. Originally from New York, she and her husband live in Maryland with their 4 curious rock star children and Justice, the hungriest Rhodesian Ridgeback you've ever met. So thank you so much. Like I said, this is actually our second book. We did read The Pearl That Broke Its Shell some years ago now. And then, of course, Sparks Like Stars. So why don't I just hand it over to you directly, and anything I'm missing from that intro, or are you still an active doctor, or how do you do it all?
No, I appreciate that. I think, and that's a question I get asked a lot, but it's really hard. I think we all struggle with that really big, heavy word called balance and trying to find the right amount of this and that we're doing in our lives, and sometimes feeling like we're not doing enough of any of them. So I have the same, struggle as everyone else. I think I am not working as a pediatrician these days. I've put, all of my time essentially into writing, home, and these different organizations that I'm a part of, and it fills the day. It fills the day very, very completely. But I'm fortunate, and I love the flexibility that comes with writing as well. It gives me a lot as well.
It must be so fascinating because, like, you hear doctors talk about sort of like how fulfilling that is, but all the work you do for Afghanistan, like that must be kind of comparable.
It is, I mean, I think I'm really lucky because I get to do something that I love doing. I love being involved with these organizations. What we're working on now is we've got an annual event that's coming up where we've got an art exhibit of these sort of, Banksy style Afghan artists that are coming together with some Afghan musicians who were recently evacuated, and that's going to be at the fundraising event for Ashiana, the organization that I'm a board member of. And this morning I got to zoom in and talk to 2 groups of high school students who read one of my novels. So that's really fulfilling too, is to be able to talk to young people and hear their questions and hear how they're connecting to some of these novels. Kids who are not Afghan or Afghan American, but understanding some of the universal themes and talking to a teacher who's introduced these works into a classroom. So I'm lucky I get to do something that's really fulfilling, because it was really fulfilling to be a pediatrician as well. That's a real privilege to be in the presence of families, in good times and sometimes not so good times.
Yeah, I didn't even touch on the amount of people that read these books, and like it's a door into a world that most of us don't visit very often, unfortunately.
Yeah, and even as a writer, I mean, these are worlds that I visit through the books, and I think that's what's helpful to me is to not just feel, sometimes outraged or upset or devastated by some situations that are happening a world away, or to the ancestral homeland that we still feel a real big connection to, but to be able to explore them and to kind of dive into that world. Sparks Like Stars is not about a world that I can step into, really. It's a historical fiction piece, but to revisit it, by going through people who lived at that time, who experienced that set of events, helps me to understand it better and then hopefully to convey it to others.
So let's touch on the book a little bit before I definitely want to talk about the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, as well as sort of like what's going on in Afghanistan today. But before we do that, the book. So you've written 4 adult titles, and I just want to know, is there something that ties them all together?
I think the thing that ties them together is that it's the Afghan experience, Afghan to Afghan American experience. These stories are really what I call like the stories that I wish I would have found on the shelf as a young reader when I would like tear through the local library during the summers or my school library or the bookstores even when I was in college and just looking for reads. And I love reading diversely. And I realized, later in life that I think I was looking for stories like this that would reflect some of the journeys of my family members, some of the things that we would talk about a lot around the dinner table. And so that's the thing that ties these stories together. It's, I recently did a book club with somebody who said, I've been reading a lot of Afghan novels since I was in high school. And I thought I never had that option.
Mm.
But there's a lot more that's available out there right now, which is really nice to see that different representation on the shelves.
We've actually had a lot of authors say that they have written the books that they missed themselves growing up, and not only historical, like the historical stories that got missed, but also being represented themselves in stories. So I can really understand what you're saying there. Ladies, again, just if you want to ask a question live, this is a wonderful opportunity. But if you have a question for Nadia and you want to put it in the chat, please feel free. I'll make sure that it gets asked. So you've also written some books for children, or not children, they're young readers. What's that experience like, and why did you choose to do those 2 books?
So that was really at my agent's beckoning. So she, called me one day, and the first book that this club read was The Pearl That Broke Its Shell of mine, which is about a young girl who's transformed from a girl into a son in the family just by changing her outward appearance, and then she's sort of able to help the family in different ways until she turns 13. Her family transforms her back into a girl and then marries her off to a warlord. So it's a rough read because there's a lot that's happening in there that's challenging to take on even for adults. But it became something that book clubs really like to kind of gather around and talk about. There's a lot of themes in there. And so my agent called me one day and she was like, listen, there's a lot of stuff in here for book clubs. I think you should write this story for a younger audience. And I wasn't even thinking about doing anything like that. And I'm like, Helen, but I'm writing for adults. And she said, you'll figure it out. And that was her direction. So I did. I sat down and sort of started to read middle grade books to wrap my head around that, around that genre and the tone and the approach to it. And I hadn't been reading middle grade books in a while, so from that came wanting to convey similar themes, but in a way that was friendlier for a younger audience. And so that's why I started writing one, and then I liked it because that took me into schools and put me in conversations with young readers who are amazing. I mean, sometimes you just get really interesting questions about the characters, or inevitably in every school visit, a child will come up to me and say, I've also written a book, and they have something that's available on Amazon. And so we get to talk about the writing process a little bit, which is nice.
Amazing. Did your children help in that process at all?
I would love to say yes, but no, no, no. I think they're part of the general, I think, inspiration that the way that conversations are happening. I'm definitely listening to my kids and kind of the banter between them, the bickering between siblings, the things that they're interested in. So all of that does come into the story. My kids are now at an age where they can read the middle grade books, and my daughter is looking to read the adult books, but she's coming up on 12, so she's getting close to that age where I think I may be able to do a mother-daughter read with her through it. I have a young adult book that's coming out next year, hopefully, so that will be maybe more up her alley and his alley.
Lori actually has a live question, so let's go to Lori.
Hi, Lori.
Hi. Thank you so much for arranging this interview. It's lovely to meet the author. And I have to tell you, Nadia, I loved your book. I loved the story. I don't have a question. I just want to tell you how strong this young girl is and how proud I was of her and the way that she was raised by both of her loving, strong parents to be a loving, strong girl. And the fact that she went through terrible times that I could never in my lifetime have imagined going through. And she went through them and she was so strong and she never wavered from her truth. And I was just overwhelmed by the story and the way that you went into the history and you explained the history of Afghanistan and pre-Afghanistan. And I love historical fiction. So that set off all kinds of, I just loved reading about it and hearing about other countries and other realities and other lives. And the fact that Afghanistan today is not the Afghanistan, the beloved Afghanistan that it once was. And I my heart breaks for it. And my heart breaks for all these brave young women that are currently living there and under far worse conditions. So thank you. Thank you for sharing and thank you for talking today.
No, thank you, Lori. And that's really, you really got to the heart of why I wrote this story. It's because, in the conversations that I've been having with people over the years, around these other stories, what I really felt was missing was the knowledge that there was a time of peace in Afghanistan, that it's not a country of forever war, that it did nurture the people who live there, and that there's a deep and profound love and affection for the city of Kabul itself. So my parents grew up in a very peaceful Kabul. My dad now, they left right before the conflict started. So my dad now reflects and says that he had the best of it, because he never saw it. He never saw it in war. He never saw it any of the destruction until, we went back and visited, but he didn't live through any of that. And people from Kabul actually do refer to the city not just as Kabul, but they'll often call it Kabul John, and John means like my dear. So they actually add a term of endearment, like to say, my beloved New York, but that becomes like what is common in referring to the city because there's such affection and such nostalgia. And that was the one thing I wanted to convey with the story is that to really understand the level of grief people have from Afghanistan for a homeland that's been lost, you really have to understand what they've lost. And they've lost that. They've lost a place that was very sweet to them, where they had family, where they had music, where they had culture, and they had enough freedom that they felt like they could do what they wanted to do. And and so that loss, to know now like how far down it's gone and just how deep the hole is, that's one thing I wanted this character to portray was that level of grief.
Thank you. You did it very well. And I love the strong women that helped her and adopted her and took her under their wing and risked their lives for her. They were just very amazing, strong women and very supportive male role figures. I was very, very impressed, especially by her father.
Yeah, he's a beloved voice that's in her ear. So thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Lori, so much for your question. I'm going to ask, sorry, I'm just trying to maneuver the thing. I'm going to ask Joanne to ask her question as well live.
Okay. Again, I resonated with Lori. Loved the book, loved the genre. It was, you really immersed the reader into the characters' lives, and I loved that. My question is, given your background connection with the musical troupe of women, and I haven't seen them live, but I've seen them on television, wondering if you'll write their story from a fictional perspective, but something that has a lot of truth to it. And I love that about your story. Thank you.
No, thanks for that question. So I think you're referring to the women who are here from the Afghan National Orchestra, the Zora Orchestra, the female orchestra. And yeah, we have, I just met for the first time the cellist, the violinist, the vocalist, the piano player, and the conductor. They're really remarkable young women who were part of an orchestra, and many of them were the first, to do so in Afghanistan. So, really strong people, really resilient young women who are here and are starting over. And so their journeys have been really interesting. We went together to a couple of events. The last one being actually a Nowruz, which is the Lunar New Year. The first day of spring is our New Year, and so there was a festival at the White House, a celebration. So I was there with them, and I remember one of the young women saw there was a band playing in the White House, and she just gravitated towards the violinists and the string instruments, and she was just watching them, and she said, I can do that too. And she realized all of a sudden that she is standing in the White House, and she could play in the same way that these individuals could, who were performing at the White House. And so it's like a world of possibilities just opening up in their minds when everything has really been taken away from them, because music has been such a threat in Afghanistan right now. So it's really remarkable to see their journeys. Will I write about it? I don't know, but I do get a lot of inspiration from the people that I see around me and the real life stories. And this is one that I think is really an incredible representation of what Afghans have lost, because music is so important, so precious to us. And that's something that has very deliberately and cruelly been taken away right now. So I think it's a really important way to convey that loss and to convey a part of Afghan culture that's sort of being erased right now.
Thank you so much for your perspective on that. And the culture too, when I was watching it, I was struck by, it's not just one stereotypical regalia or outfit. There were multiple cultures that reflected their backgrounds, and I was struck by that as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Joanne.
Jill, I see your hand up. I'm just going to ask one question before I come to you. So Sparks Like Stars is an incredible tale. There's a huge amount of historical data involved. How did you do all that research?
I have to say the research for this book was like probably the most fun that I've had, and took me in very, very different directions. For one, taking a look at the role of the American Foreign Service officers and what that experience was. So to get to Antonia's story, I dove into, there's these online archives of Foreign Service officers who sort of do these exit interviews, and they talk about their experiences in different locations around the world. So I looked specifically for those who were located in Kabul during the years just before the coup, during the coup, and just immediately after, to get a sense of what the vibe was. Were they expecting this? Were they not expecting this? And from those archives came some of the most interesting details that end up in the story, because I could not make it up, like the fact that they were putting on a performance of the musical Oklahoma, and that they were having cocktails with members of other countries, including the Russians, like the night before. The fact that after the coup, one of the Foreign Service officers went to meet with the new Minister of Education, and his a revolver fell out of his pocket, and she was pretty sure that he was drunk at the time. And including that, one Foreign Service officer had a mom visiting during the coup, and the mom was on a rooftop having, I think, cocktails when these jets started flying overhead. And that was where the character of Tilly came from, because I thought, my gosh, whose mom would be visiting, and who would be wild enough to just be out there kind of having cocktails? And it's a completely different Kabul than what we would think of American Foreign Service officers doing in the last 20 years in that city. But that's where it gets really delicious, is when you find those little details. And so that's where Tilly came from. And then I had to do research into, okay, what about some women who are you know, a little advanced in the years, but still like to party and have a good time. And what is it like if they get high? And, you know, finding videos online of like women getting high and exploring it that way, right? So, so that, and then looking at the artifacts from historical sites, from archaeological sites in Afghanistan, and you know what those pieces look like, what area they represented, where they come from, and what was actually happening at the time to some of those treasures that had been uncovered. And so, you know, I've got these, you know, articles from different time periods where it shows people kind of opening up these crates of artifacts that have been dug up from these sites, and you know, just kind of weaving all of these different pieces into the story, including the hippies. I mean, that was one of the best parts, was taking a look at this guidebook that actually was circulating at that time for people who were the overlanders traveling that route. And oh my gosh, in there, it's just, you definitely, whoever wrote it was high, like super high at the time that they wrote it. And they talk about, you know, where in Turkey you can get the best massage, and how this person was, you know, given a massage by this enormous Turkish woman who came in there, and she's trying to peel off her jeans, and you know, there's like a tiny little red underwear, and anyway, it's like a whole messy situation. But all of those details kind of, you know, enriched my experience as I was diving into that time period, and are in the story somehow and somewhere.
Amazing. I love to hear those kind of things. Lori wants to know if the ring actually existed.
So that specific ring doesn't exist, but it's something that's very similar to the pieces that I saw in, there's a National Geographic like coffee table book that has images of all these different pieces, the collection that circulated for a time. I don't know actually where the collection is right now, but it's sort of a made up piece, but based on the types of jewelry that I found in that book.
And how, while we're talking about sort of research and everything, like historical fiction is, I mean, you're telling of a time that not a lot of people have read about. So how important is it to you that it's historically factual? And to that, was there a family like Satara's?
So that part gets really important to me. Zatara's family is fictional, but it's based on, you know, my best guesses for what would have been in the palace. I mean, one of the other pieces of research that I did use was one of the individuals who survived the coup that night was a grandson of the president at that time, and I think he was a teenage boy during the coup, and so he survived the coup, as some members of the family did. He had been injured and was taken to a local hospital, was at the hospital for a while, and then I think got evacuated out of the country, actually by the Shah of Iran, went to Iran before this family went off to Europe. And so he, I don't know what year it was, but he did an interview as an adult talking about the events of that night and going through sort of a play-by-play of what unfolded and what it was like for the family members who were kind of like huddled up and waiting to see, you know, what's happening, what's going on, and what's the outcome going to be. And talking about how, you know, his grandfather, who was the president at the time, encouraged the rest of the family to leave, but said he was going to stay, and then his grandmother said, no, I'm going to stay too. And so it was a mix of, you know, different reactions of people doing, you know, figuring out what they're going to do through this coup and what does this mean, because I don't think they even really fully understood in the moment what the implications of that night were. So it's, you know, she's a made up person, but inserted into a world that was as close to truthful as I could get, because you're right, it is a time period that's not talked about very much. And so that makes it all the more important for me to be as close to the truth as possible in telling the story.
Jill, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Hi, Oklahoma representation here. I just wanted to let Nadia know. So we actually have already had our meeting this month, and your book had really great reviews and feedback, but they sent me to ask a few questions from the group. One of them was maybe feedback questions. So everyone loved the idea of the ring and the archaeological site where it came from. And everyone really thought that this would be a great prequel spinoff, something about who owned the ring or who the ring belonged to prior to becoming an artifact at that archaeological site. And so everybody really wanted me to let you know that.
Oh, that's a great idea. Oh, I love that. That's diving even further back. Yeah, that's a wonderful idea.
And then we had some other discussions that were really surrounding like about Afghanistan present day. And so we were wondering if you had been there previously, and the process that it takes for you to visit there now. Just because a lot of us were talking about how great the Overlander characters were and how amazing it would have been at that time to feel free enough and safe enough to go to that part of the world and experience that culture, and how we all talked about like, from what very little we know, it's presented to us by, the media and things that are going on in the world, how we very much would be interested in this part of the world, but all feel very concerned and unsafe about trying to travel there. So maybe some feedback that you have about that experience.
Yeah, so Afghanistan's a really complicated place, and I think it's really complicated, especially right now. And so in the last 20 years, it would have been okay to travel there, and there were a lot of people who were going back and forth. And then we had the Taliban takeover in 2021, and it was sort of a military but very quick takeover of the country. I think a lot of the groundwork for the takeover had been laid in the year and a half to 2 years prior to the event actually happening and the US withdrawal. So the situation right now is that I could pick up and travel to Afghanistan. I could go there, I could land in the airport, and I would probably be okay. I could go and maybe visit family or whatever I want to do. But I'm not sure. And I think it's that uncertainty that makes it really wild, right? We've seen little like travel logs and travel diaries and videos that are out there of Westerners, even Western women, a couple Western women who have gone to Afghanistan, even now under Taliban control, and travel through the country. And they're kind of like posting these videos saying everything's okay. The problem with that being that it may be okay because they know to be watchful around a Western person who's coming to the country and visiting, because there's going to be a lot of attention paid there. But the ambiance and the situation for women who live in Afghanistan, who have to stay there, is terrible right now. And there are restrictions every day that come out about women's movements, about their job opportunities. And so at this point, they've just allowed the girls who are in the elementary school level to go back to school. But you still have women who can't go to college. The jobs have been taken away from them. You don't have women in journalism anymore. You don't have any women in government anymore. And journalism and government were actually two fields where there were a lot of women involved. And that had been really good. There was a Ministry of Women's Affairs. They took that away right in the beginning and replaced it with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which is the same type of ministry that was running around the first time, and kind of accusing people of not being dressed appropriately, not being fully covered, and you shouldn't be talking to two young people shouldn't be talking to each other, and so this is allegations of an inappropriate relationship and public floggings, and so all these kinds of things that are happening that make it a really ugly place for the women who have to be there. And at the same time, in different areas of Afghanistan, the rules are not enforced to the same extent because there's a lot of local rule too. So in some areas, people have been able to get private schools, exceptions to teach young girls. In other areas, not, right? In some areas, they'll say that the Taliban have issued an edict that women cannot travel without a male relative as their escort. And then you talk to some women, they're like, well, I am able to, but the rules are there. And that's what makes it a threat, because at any given moment, somebody could choose to enforce it and they've got a law to back them up. So that's the trouble with it. Like you could potentially go there, but who knows what's going to happen? It's like everyone's on thin ice, and that makes it really scary.
Thank you.
Great question, Jill. Thank you
Yeah.
for that. Linda, it's nice to see your face. I always hear your voice, but I never see your face.
Hello, I'm not that camera ready, but it's all right. We're among friends. Nadia, I agree with all the comments about just how wonderful the book was and the strength of the characters and how I just felt so invested in the story. I'm always curious how in your writing process the characters evolve, and do you have in mind like where they're going to fall on the spectrum of good to bad before you begin? And specifically, I forget the soldier's name.
Mhm.
How do you say it?
Cher.
Cher.
Yeah, singer.
Who started off appearing to be, you know, kind of the bad guy, but it turns out he saved her life and, you know, became quite sympathetic in the end when you understood a little bit more of his story. But like about him in particular, but then in general, your writing process.
Yeah, so, you know, there have been times in the past, well, there are always times where I get stuck in writing a story and I'm like, oh, I don't know what happens next. And I remember in one conversation with my agent, Helen, who is just really, really astute, and she's a wonderful agent. And she asked me, are the characters talking to you? And I was like, Helen, are you okay? Like, what are you talking about? And she says, no, but are the characters talking to you? Because you need them to talk to you, and then you'll know what the story is doing. And I had to think about that for a bit, but it makes a lot of sense to me now. And I realize that is what happens when the story's going well. It's that I know the characters so well, I can see them to the point where I don't have to wonder what they're going to do in a situation, because I can just see them do it and then I'm recording it. And so I'm not so much like creating as I am documenting. But that only comes from seeing the characters and knowing them really well and having them be truly three-dimensional. And so to your point about Cher and what kind of person he is, I really am drawn personally to characters who are not purely good, who are not purely evil, but who are like a mess, and where we're trying to figure out how we feel about them. And I wasn't sure how I felt about him. Sometimes I'm still not sure how I feel about him. I think Cher is not sure how he feels about himself. And I also think that the same for the main character, for Ariana, because even when she's an adult and she's so resilient and she's thriving and she seems to have her life together, she's making decisions that if I were her bestie, I'd be like, girl, you need to sit down. We need to talk. Like, how are you doing, really?
She
Right?
was
Like,
popping
when are
some
you
pills
process?
and
Right. And she's just, you know, she's packaged things up and pushed them to the side and not really addressing what she's carrying with her. But that's what's interesting to me in a story, is watching these characters evolve and watching them be messy and struggle with, you know, what do I think about them? What do they think of themselves? And how are they going to feel? And what are they going to be by the end of the story?
well, it definitely worked. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, for your question. Sorry. I wanted to talk about the boyfriend. So I liked the boyfriend initially. I was like, oh, he's great. He's great. And I was like, what are you doing? You're going to ruin it. And then of course he wasn't great. And I loved the love story. I mean, it was a light romance and kind of woven throughout there, but it felt very authentic in the end that she ended up with, and I forget everybody's name, so I apologize.
With Clay. Yeah. I'm not a romantic person, I have to say. I mean, I'm more of like a realist and probably too practical for that. But I do like a good love story if I know the characters really well. And that's where, you know, she's also not a romantic. She's not swooning over anyone anytime soon. But I think she's looking for a real connection. And her boyfriend at the time also is not a terrible person. He's not the greatest person, but I think he's also getting swept up in the activities and what his, you know, new role is demanding of him, and he just goes down a path where he's not ideal. He's not ideal, and so maybe he needs to grow from that too. But I think he's forgivable. I don't think he's totally terrible. And she has some part in it, in my mind. She's not absolutely forthcoming in that relationship.
No.
And that's where, you know, I feel like she has some work to do at that part of the story. But yeah, there's enough love in there to sort of, you know, be okay with me, but not have me feeling like, oh my gosh, this is too cheesy.
Well, even the relationship with her mother, I mean, obviously a very difficult relationship. Um, having and like the way that her mother's life changed so drastically as a result of deciding to sort of like foster this child, right? But I was very sad
Yeah.
when Grandma died.
Um, you know, I really wanted to also in this story take a look at mother-daughter relationships, and so there are just some different types that are in there. You know, there's biological, and then there's chosen, and this is where I really had fun kind of exploring what their dynamic might be like, and how Antonia with this dynamic life might have been as a mother, because she's someone. So that was another field of research that I did, was just taking a look at what it was like for American Foreign Service officers at that time, and how strong they had to be, because there was sort of a general belief that any woman who got married would have to resign from the Foreign Service. You couldn't be married and be in the Foreign Service. I remember one woman wrote that she specifically and deliberately lied on her resume about her typing skills, because she said, if I told them I could type really well, they would put me in as a secretary, and I wanted a real post. And so there was a real struggle within the Foreign Service too. And so that got me thinking, and what kind of woman is this Antonia, who will pick up and choose this type of life and prioritize that over, you know, a life that's probably more ordinary, or the default.
Absolutely. And was she always going to meet the you guys just talked about the guy's name and now I don't know it. But was she always going to see him like 40 years later in a hospital in the States?
Oh, the guard.
Okay.
That was, yeah, you know, I that was sort of what I wanted from the beginning, was I want this event, and then I want her to go back to that event as an adult. Because I think for a lot of people who go through something that's really big, that's really traumatic, they do have the same reaction that she has, where a lot of people who've actually immigrated to this country have experienced something, but don't have the time, the space, or the luxury to deal with it. And so they come here and they get busy in the work of, you know, resurrecting their lives, and either jumping back into school, or diving into really busy work, or just, you know, trying to feed their family. And so whatever they are carrying with them is completely unprocessed, but it's playing out in their relationship. It's playing out in, you know, the lack of sleep that they're getting. So that's really what I wanted, was for her to be forced to face it, to be forced to revisit that period of time. And it was through him that I wanted that to happen, because I also wanted to struggle with a character who was involved with that military coup, but who maybe thought he was there for the right reasons, and maybe sort of had good intentions, and how complicated that can be when people are, you know, following orders or doing something that they think it will be for the greater good.
Yeah, there was just so many themes in this book, so much going on. The U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, can you tell us a little bit about a little bit more about that? There's actually a great article by you, Nadia, on Mother Jones, the fall of Kabul through the eyes of the women who survived it. And I just I want to also add to that question, what is it like? And we know that the situation is dire in Kabul for women, and so what is it like to leave? Is it a possibility? Is it? Can you speak to all of those questions?
Yeah, so okay, so I'll start with US CRI, US Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. It's a nonprofit that's been around for a really long time, that works on resettlement of immigrants and refugees here in the United States. And so I was involved in a mental health program. We kind of designed this mental health program for the Afghan evacuees who are coming over. If you guys saw those images of people sort of, you know, getting loaded onto planes and flying out of the airport during that evacuation, those people came over and had to be, you know, processed, and they went through an entire screening and medical evaluation, and a lot had to happen before they could be sort of prepared for resettlement in different areas of the country. And so I worked on a mental health program for the families, which included, you know, sitting down with individuals and kind of seeing if people had specific needs, if they needed to talk to a counselor or a therapist, or actually just organizing some wellness activities to get people doing something instead of just sort of, you know, lingering on these military bases or even in hotels for some of them. The best part was doing stuff with children. So we had, you know, activities for children. That was pretty interesting to see how interested they were in just getting into something that felt like a classroom again. So these kids would show up like ready to learn and just so excited. You know, for the women who left, they've sort of been given a new opportunity to do a lot here. So there were some young women who, you know, even at the time they were on the bases, they were already trying to figure out how they could apply to colleges over here and just pick up where they left off. For the women who are back in Afghanistan right now, I mean, so many are just desperate to leave, including my husband's cousin, who has 3 young daughters, and she herself, you know, she speaks English, she's got a degree, and she's just like, there's nothing for me here. I've gotten messages from college students, one right after the takeover, who said, you know, I don't know what it's going to be like when I try to go to university tomorrow. At that time, the universities were still open, but she was just scared of what it was going to be like now that the Taliban were in control. And then, of course, the universities were closed. One message that I got from her, she sent me a poem she'd written, and at some point she just said, I just feel like I'm being buried alive here. There are not really a lot of options for people to leave because they'd have to get a passport. To get a passport, the office is now controlled by the Taliban. People are having to pay a large sum of money to get on the list to get a passport. The economic situation is really bad. And then to get accepted to another country, to the US, for example, you'd have to have an interview with an American embassy. There's no American embassy in Afghanistan right now. Not a lot of countries have embassies. Some do, but they may not be taking people. So there's not a lot of countries that are accepting Afghans right now, or Afghan women. Some countries are opening up some spots to universities for Afghan women because of the situation, but the opportunities are very slim.
That's awful. Linda,
Yeah.
I'll let
Try to
you.
be really like a lot more uplifting in my conversations with people these days, but it's getting really hard, I have to say. I mean, this is just not the time. I think things will get better only because I think things can't really get worse.
Right.
So it's the only positive way of looking at things, but it's going to be a while.
So I have another question, Nadia. I was just thinking about your backstory and how you talked about kind of the books you wished existed when you were younger, but at what point in your career were you always a writer? Or at what point did you decide I'm going to try my hand at writing a novel?
So it was about a year after my husband and I got married. We hadn't actually lived together before we got married. We were in different areas of the country in this like long distance. And so we were living together, and he really then at that point got to see like how bad my reading habit was, like how much I really love to read, like over all other things, right? And so at some point he said, you know, you love these stories so much. I think you've got a story in you. I think you want to write one. And at first I was like, yeah, okay, you know, but then it became a real idea and a real thing in my head. And I thought, okay, well, if I didn't want to write, what would I want to write about?
Were you a practicing pediatrician at that point, or?
Yes. Yeah. So I started writing, but we didn't have 4 kids at that time. So it was a little bit easier. I would come home on days that I wasn't working, you know, I didn't have a shift in the emergency room, and I would just sort of, you know, pull out the computer and start to see if I could create a story. So it came really at his nudge, because he does feel like it's important to record stories. He was born and raised in Afghanistan, and he also knows that, you know, we don't have a lot on the shelves, and the importance of legacy is something that we talk about in the home as well. So that's where the initial nudge came from, and then it was like, well, you know, one story worked, and so you got more that follow.
Wow, that's amazing. And good for him.
Yes, it's so nice to hear that you have such a supportive husband. That I mean, I guess you'd have to with everything you have going on.
Yeah, you really can't do it without support. I mean, I feel really blessed that I have his encouragement, that he feels like this is, because this is not a very secure field, right? Like the writing books is not plan A.
Yeah.
It's you don't fall back onto it. So but I have, parents and extended family, everyone who makes this important and helps me to do it.
Well, and I mean, I can't say this enough. Like historical fiction is not my genre, but there's a few historical fiction books that I absolutely adore, like The Great Alone by and The Four Winds. But like this is right up there, like with them. Like I recommend this book to everybody I talk to, especially the historical fiction fans, because it's like it's so poetic. It's just so well written and so well done. Like you're incredibly talented.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. There's really, like, honestly, no higher praise than recommending a book to others, because you really you put your name on the line when you say, here, I think you should read this, right? 'Cause we invest a lot of our time into these stories, and people don't have time. So we're not able to spend our time reading things that I think, don't really move us. So I really appreciate that.
So we're running out of time, so I just have a couple more questions. One of them is if there's any other authors that, if we wanted to sort of explore more, maybe on Afghanistan or other parts of Afghanistan, or other history, anybody you recommend that we could look into?
Yeah, well, I think everyone knows the name Khalid Hosseini, so that's an obvious source. I think there are also some others who are coming out now. Diba Zargarpur has a YA book that's more on like the Afghan American experience, and it's sort of like a little bit of maybe some magical, a little bit of paranormal in it. So it's an interesting, completely different like YA category. And then there's The Haunting of Haji Hotak by Jamil Kochai. I think I'm getting that right. I don't have a copy here behind me. And then the others are, there's a lot of nonfiction as well that's about Afghanistan. So maybe not necessarily written by Afghan Americans, but the other Afghan author I should mention is Atia Abawi, who's written YA books that really talk about the Afghan experience. So that's she's got great novels too. And then the nonfiction. So journalists like Carlotta Gall and you're so good at getting those names down right away. I'm impressed. Like the Wrong Enemy by Carlotta Gall. There is I should have wrote these down. Ghost Wars by Steve Cole, Coll, another journalist. I mean, these are books that, and then there's the Afghanistan Papers by Craig Whitlock, was one of the more recent ones, a Washington Post journalist. And so these books kind of like won't make you feel good about the way the war went down and the involvement, and there's a lot in there about the CIA's operations, and but they're really enlightening, and they completely kind of transform the way people will look at the situation, and the United States' involvement in Afghanistan.
Thank you. I want to also know if you're writing full time. Well, not full time. You're doing all the other things you do, but you're writing. You're not doctoring. So, do we have another book to look forward to?
So we've got, I am just now, I've finished and the revisions are in on what will be my first young adult book. And so that is expected, I believe, summer of next year. Because now that it's off of my desk, it actually takes like an entire year for the publishing company to do the layout and the design and all those different pieces that make it into a full package. So that's there. And now I am just like freshly about to start drafting a new adult novel.
And will it also be based in Afghanistan?
I don't know. And so this is like the really exciting part where I get to decide and play around with some different ideas. It's also the really like intimidating part because there are so many different options, and pinning down one and trying to figure out which way the story is going is it's a challenge, but it's a fun one.
And your young adult novel, can you tell us the premise of it?
Yeah, so it's about a family with siblings who are growing up and sort of dealing with what is it like to be an Afghan American in a town that is also struggling with its own reactions to an influx of immigrants. And so it's really set against the context of these Afghan evacuees who've come over, and how the United States, different communities responded to that in largely positive ways, and sometimes with some challenges as well.
Amazing. Well, we'll certainly look out for that. Thank you everybody for joining us, and a massive thank you to you, Nadia, for taking the time to speak to us. It's been very enlightening, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you all so much. I mean, I honestly, I'm a reader, so I know just how many incredible books are out there that we have to choose from to read and spend our time with. So thank you for spending your hours with this one.
Awesome. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.